I guess it helps if I mute. But apparently my sound effects still aren't working. I was testing through all the different ones and it just wasn't coming up at all. Because everything's been refreshed on it, everything is logged in on it. They're just not playing. Let's see. Try it again. Because I'm hearing them, but it's not playing on stream. And none of them seem to be. And I honestly can't think of any reason why they aren't. Other than somehow OBS being screwed up. That's a quick sample of how fast I type. Okay, I heard that. What the heck hell was that? I try that. That's. Okay, I heard it fire on mine end. And it didn't play that time. I don't know what's going on. I wish I knew, because nothing else updated for the past week. And yet, they worked last week, and they're not working this week. Let me see if I can play anything from my dashboard. Okay. Well, that didn't work. Is my blurb DTS going to work? Again, I heard it. The Burp GTS is bits only, unfortunately, for now. That's weird. Okay, well, I don't know. How many other things are not working? There's a mana. Oop. Helps if I type correctly. I guess I'll have to turn off the redeems for now, because I don't want you guys wasting points if I can't get them working, you know? Aw, oh, man. They've got Drops of Dragon's Dogma 2 that doesn't do me any good because I can't play the damn game. I hate that I'm having to do this. That's like something that I wanted you guys to be able to do. It just generally sucks that I don't get to do this. Because I've been trying to find more ways of getting interaction, because with Storyteller reading I don't really get much of a chance to just chat with the way I do it. What is a mana? I don't know half the Pokemon. Mana is a little blob thing. Okay, whatever. And why is Stream Elements not using the rot? I just don't know what the hell is going on. And how many different things do I have text-to-speech set up for? Everything's installed. I don't get it. This is like really extremely discouraging. everything on the websites say that it's connected and working. I don't know. But we're already running late. Check something real quick. That didn't work. Oh well. I guess we'll go ahead and switch over. So, we are reading the Green Fairy book tonight. Or at least reading some more of it anyway. I'm going to try to do at least 2 or 3 stories. I'm sorry the sound alerts aren't working. But, yeah. My streams have become 75% scuff anymore. So kids, just sit back, relax, and enjoy the stories, and maybe you'll fall asleep, and maybe I'll shriek like a banshee. I don't know. Depends on the story, I suppose. But anyway, our first fairy tale for this fabulous Friday night is The Enchanted Snake. There was once upon a time a poor woman who would have given all she possessed for a child, but she hadn't one. Now it happened one day that her husband went to the wood to collect brushwood, and when he had brought it home he discovered a pretty little snake among the twigs. When Sabatella, for that was the name of the peasant's wife, saw the little beast, she sighed deeply and sighed, "Even the snakes have their brood. I am unfortunate and have no children." No sooner had she said these words than, to her intense surprise, the little snake looked up at her face and spoke. "Since you have no children, be a mother to me instead, and I will promise you will never repent it, for I will love you as if I was your own son." At first, Sabatella was frightened to death at hearing a snake speak. But plucking up her courage, she replied, "If it weren't for any other reason than your kindly thought, I would agree to what you say, and I will love you and look after you like a mother." So she gave the snake a little hole in the front of the house for its bed, and fed it with all the nicest food she could think of, and seemed as if she never could show it enough kindness. Day by day it grew bigger and fatter, and at last one morning it said to Cola Matteo, the peasant, whom it had always regarded as his father, "Dear Papa, I am now of a suitable age, and wish to marry." "I'm quite agreeable," answered Matteo, "and I'll do my best to find another snake like yourself and arrange a match between you." "Why, if you do that," replied the snake, "we shall be no better than the vipers and reptiles, and that's not at all what I want. No, I'd much prefer to marry the king's daughter. Therefore I pray you to go without further delay and demand an audience with the king, and tell him a snake wishes to marry his daughter." Cola Matthew, who was rather a simpleton, went as he desired to the king, and having obtained an audience, he said, "Your Majesty, I have often heard that people lose nothing by asking, so I have come to inform you that a snake wants to marry your daughter, and I'd be glad to know if you're willing to mate a dove with a serpent." The king, who saw at once that the man was a fool, said, in order to get quit of him, "Go home and tell your friend the snake that if he can turn this palace into ivory, inlaid with gold and silver, before tomorrow at noon, I will let him marry my daughter." And with a hearty laugh, he dismissed the peasant. When Cola Mateo brought his answer back to the snake, the little creature didn't seem the least bit put out, but said, "Tomorrow morning before sunrise, you must go to the wood and gather a bunch of green herbs, and then rub the threshold of the palace with them, and you'll see what will happen." Cola Mateo, who was, as I've said before, a great simpleton, made no reply. But before sunrise next morning, he went to the wood, and got a bunch of St. John's wort and rosemary and such like herbs, and rubbed them as he had been told on the floor of the palace. Hardly had he done so when the walls immediately turned into ivory, so richly inlaid with gold and silver that they dazzled the eyes of all the beholders. The king, when he rose and saw the miracle that had been performed, was beside himself with amazement, and frankly didn't know what in the world he was to do. But when Cola Mateo came next day, and in the name of the snake demanded the hand of the princess, the king replied, "Don't be in such a hurry. If the snake really wants to marry my daughter, he must do some more things first. First, one of these is to turn all the paths and walls of my garden into pure gold, before tomorrow noon." When the snake was told of this new condition, he replied, "Tomorrow morning, early, you must go and collect all the odds and ends of rubbish you can in the streets, and then take them and throw them on the paths and walls of the garden, and you'll see then if we won't know more than a match for the old king." So, Cola Mateo rose at cockcrow, took a large basket under his arm, and carefully collected all the broken fragments of pots and pans, and jugs and lamps, and other trash of that sort. No sooner had he scattered them over the paths and walls of the king's garden than they became one blaze of glittering gold, so that everyone's eyes were dazzled with the brilliancy, and everyone's soul was filled with wonder. The king, too, was amazed at the sight, but still he couldn't make up his mind to part with his daughter. So when Cola Mateo came to remind him of his promise, he replied, "I have still a third demand to make. If the snake can turn all the trees and fruit in my garden into precious stones, then I promise him my daughter in marriage." When the peasant informed the snake what the king had replied, "Tomorrow morning, early, you must go to the market and buy all the fruit you see there, and sow all the stones and seeds in the palace garden, and, if I'm not mistaken, the king will be satisfied with the result." Cola Mateo rose at dawn, and taking a basket on his arm, he went to the market and bought all the pomegranates, apricots, cherries, and other fruit he could find there, and sowed the seeds and stones in the palace garden. In one moment, the trees were ablaze with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and every other precious stone you can think of. This time the king felt obligated to keep his promise, and calling his daughter to him, he said, "My dear Granolinaya, for That was the princess's name. More as a joke than anything else, I demanded what seems to be impossibilities from your bridegroom. But now that he has done all I required, I am bound to stick to my part of the bargain. So be a good child, and as you love me, do not force me to break my word, but give yourself up with as good grace as you can, and in most unhappy fate. Do with me what you like, my lord and father. Your will is my law, answered Grannonia. When the king heard this, he told Cola Mateo to bring the snake to the palace, and said that he was prepared to receive the creature as his son-in-law. The snake arrived at court in a carriage made of gold and drawn by 6 white elephants. But whatever it appeared on the way, the people fled in terror at the sight of the frightful reptile. When the snake reached the palace, all the courtiers shook and trembled with fear down to the very scullion, and the king and queen were in such a state of nervous collapse that they hid themselves in a faraway turret. Grannonia alone kept her presence of mind, and although her father and mother implored her to fly for her life, she wouldn't move a step, saying, "I'm certainly not going to fly from the man you have chosen for my husband." As soon as the snake saw Grannonia, it wound its tail around her and kissed her. Then, leading her into a room, it shut the door, and throwing off its skin, it changed into a beautiful young man with golden locks and flashing eyes, who embraced Grannonia tenderly and said all sorts of pretty things to her. When the king saw the snake shut itself into a room with his daughter, he said to his wife, "Heaven be merciful to our child, for I fear it is all over for her now. This cursed snake will most likely have swallowed her up." Then they put their eyes to the keyhole to see what was happening. Their amazement knew no bounds when they saw the beautiful youth standing before their daughter with the snake skin lying on the floor beside him. In their excitement, they burst open the door, and seizing the skin, they threw it into the fire. But no sooner had they done this than the young man called out, "Oh, wretched people, what have you done?" And before they had time to look around, he had changed himself into a dove, and dashing against the window, he broke a pane of glass and flew away from sight. But Grannonia, who in one and the same moment saw herself merry and sad, cheerful and despairing, rich and beggared, complained bitterly over this robbery of her happiness, this poisoning of her cup of joy, this unlucky stroke of fortune, this other sign of bad luck, and laid all the blame on her parents, though they assured her that they had meant her no harm. But the princess refused to be comforted, and at night, when all inhabitants of the palace were asleep, she stole out a back door, disguised as a peasant woman, determined to seek for her lost happiness until she found it. When she got to the outskirts of town, led by the light of the moon, she met a fox who offered to accompany her, an offer which Grannonia gladly accepted, saying, "You're most heartily welcome, for I don't know my way at all around the neighborhood." So they went on their way together, and at last came to a wood, where, being tired with walking, they passed to rest under the shade of a tree, where a spring of waters sported in the tender grass, refreshing it with its crystal clear spray. They laid themselves down on the green carpet, and soon fell fast asleep, and did not waken again until the sun was high in the heavens. They rose up and stood for some time listening to the birds singing, because Grannonia was delighted with their songs. When the fox perceived this, he said, "If you only understood as I do what the little birds are saying, your pleasure would be even greater." Provoked by his words, for we all know the curiosity which is deeply inborn in every woman, as even the love of talking, Grannonia implored the fox to tell her what the birds had said. At first, the wily fox refused to tell her what he had gathered from the conversation of the birds, but at last he gave way to her entreaties and told her that they had spoken of the misfortunes of a beautiful young prince, whom a wicked enchantress had turned into a snake for a period of 7 years. At the end of this time he had fallen in love with a charming princess, but that when he had shut himself into a room with her and had thrown off his snakeskin, her parents had forced their way into the room and had burnt the skin, whereupon the prince changed into the likeness of a dove, had broken a pane of glass, and in trying to fly out of the window, he had wounded himself so badly that the doctors despaired for his life. Grannonia, when she had learnt they were talking of her lover, asked at once whose son he was, and if there was any hope of his recovery, to which the fox made answer that the birds had said he was the son of the king of Valongrosso, and that the only thing that could cure him was to rub the wounds on his head with the blood of the very birds who told his tale. Then Grannonia knelt down beside the fox and begged him, in her sweetest way, to catch the birds for her and procure their blood, promising at the same time to reward him richly. "All right," said the fox, "only don't be in such a hurry. Let's wait until night when the little birds have gone to roost, and then I'll climb up and catch them all for you." So they passed the day talking now of the beauty of the prince, and now the father of the princess, and then the misfortune that had happened. At last the night arrived, and all the little birds were asleep high up in the branches of the big tree. The fox climbed stealthily and caught the little birds with his paws, one after the other, and when he had killed them all, he put their blood into a little bottle which he wore at his side, and returned with it to Grannonia, who was beside herself with joy at the assault of the fox's raid. But the fox said, "My dear daughter, your joy is in vain, because, let me tell you, this blood is of no earthly use for you unless you add some of mine to it." And with these words, he took to his heels. Grannonia, who saw her hopes dashed to the ground in this cruel way, had recourse to flattery and cunning, weapons which have often stood the sex of good steed, and called out after the fox, "Father Fox, you would be quite right to save your skin if, in the first place, I didn't feel I owed you so much, and if, in the second, there weren't other foxes in the world. But as you know how grateful I feel to you, and there are heaps of other foxes about, you can trust yourself to me. Don't behave like a cow and kick the pails after it has filled it with milk, but continue your journey with me, and when we get to the capital, you can sell me to the king as a servant girl." Now, it never entered the fox's head that even foxes can be outwitted. So after a bit he consented to go with her. But he hadn't gone far before the cunning girl seized the stick and gave him such a blow with it on the head that he dropped down dead on the spot. Then Grannonia took some of his blood and poured it into the little bottle, and went on her way as fast as she could to Valongrosso. When she arrived there, she went straight to the royal palace and let the king be told that she had come to cure the young prince. The king commanded her to be brought before him at once, and was much astonished when he saw that it was a girl who undertook to do what all the cleverest doctors of his kingdom had failed in. It was an attempt no hurts no one. He willingly consented that she should do what she could. "All I ask," said Grannonia, "is that, should I succeed in what you desire, you will give me your son in marriage." The king, who had given up all hopes in his son's recovery, replied, "Only restore him to life and health, and he shall be yours. It is only fair to give a husband to who gives me a son." And so they went into the prince's room. The moment Granonia had rubbed the blood on his wounds, the illness left him, and he was as sound and well as ever. When the king saw his son thus marvelously restored to life and health, he turned to him and said, "My dear son, I thought of you as dead, and now, to my great joy and amazement, you are alive again. I promised this young woman that if she could cure you, to bestow your hand and heart to her. And seeing that heaven has been so gracious, you must fulfill the promise I made to her. For gratitude alone forces me to pay this debt." But the prince answered, "My lord and father, I would that my will were as free as my love for you is great. But as I have plighted my word to another maiden, you will see for yourself, and so will this young maiden, that I cannot go back from my word, and be faithless to her whom I love." When Granonia heard these words, and saw how deeply rooted the prince's love was for her, she felt very happy, and blushing rosy red, she said, "But should I get the other lady to give up her rights, would you then consent to marry me?" "Far be it from me," replied the prince, "to banish the beautiful picture of my love from my heart. Whatever she may say, my heart and desire will remain the same, and though I were to lose my life for it, I couldn't consent to this exchange." Granonia could keep silence no longer, and throwing off her peasant's disguise, she discovered herself to the prince, who was nearly beside himself with joy when he recognized his fair lady love. When then he told his father who she was and what she had done and suffered for his sake. Then they invited the king and queen of Starzalonga to the court, and they had a great wedding feast, and proved once more that there is no better seasoning for the joys of true love than a few pangs of grief. Hydrate real quick. It's still a damn shame that my sound alerts aren't working. Oh well. I don't know how much of these I could type out. Anyway. I would say that's Biter. Okay. Our second story for this wonderful Friday night of fairy tales. The Biter Bit. Once upon a time there lived a man called Simon, who was very rich, but at the same time as stingy and miserly as he could be. He had a housekeeper named Nina, a clever, capable woman, and she did her work carefully and conscientiously. Her master had the greatest respect for her. In his young days he had been one of the gayest and most attractive youths of the neighborhood, but as he grew old and stiff, he found it very difficult to walk, and his faithful servants urged him to get a horse so as to save his poor old bones. At last Simon gave way to the request and persuasive eloquence of his housekeeper, and betook himself one day to the market, where he had seen a mule, which he thought would just suit him, and which he bought for 7 gold pieces. Now it happened that there were 3 merry rascals hanging about the marketplace, who much preferred living on other people's goods to working for their own living. As soon as they saw that Simon had bought a mule, one of them said to his 2 boon companions, "My friends, this mule must be ours before we make many hours older." "But how shall we manage it?" asked one of them. "We must all 3 station ourselves at intervals during the old man's homeward way. We must each in turn declare that this mule has been bought as a donkey. If we only stick to it, you'll see a mule will soon be ours. This proposal quite satisfied the others, and they all separated as they had agreed. Now when Simon came by, the first rogue said to him, "God bless you, my fine gentleman." "Thank you for your courtesy," replied Simon. "Where have you been?" asked the thief. "Oh, to the market," was the reply. "And what did you buy there?" continued the rogue. "Oh, this mule." "Which mule?" "The one I'm sitting on, to be sure," replied Simon. "Are you in earnest or only joking?" "What do you mean?" "Because it seems to me that you've got hold of a donkey and not of a mule." "A donkey? Rubbish!" screamed Simon, and without another word he rode on his way. After a few 100 yards he met the second confederate, who addressed him. "Good day, dear sir. Where are you coming from?" "From the market," replied Simon. "Did things go pretty cheap?" asked the other. "I think just so," said Simon. "And did you make any good bargains for yourself?" "I bought this mule which you see me on." "Is it possible that you really bought that beast for a mule?" "Why, certainly." "But heavens, it's nothing but a donkey." "A donkey?" repeated Simon. "You don't mean to say so. If a single other person tells me that, I'll make him a present of the wretched animal." With these words he continued his way, and very soon met the third knave, who said to him, "God bless you, sir. Are you by any chance coming from the market?" "Yes, I am," replied Simon. "And what bargain did you drive there?" asked the cunning fellow. "I bought this mule on which I am riding." "A mule? Are you speaking seriously, or do you wish to make a fool of me?" "I'm speaking in sober earnest," said Simon. "It wouldn't occur to me to make a joke of it." "Oh, my poor friend," cried the rascal, "don't you see that that is a donkey and not a mule? You have been taken in by some wretched cheats." "You're the third person in the last 2 hours who has told me the same thing," said Simon. "I couldn't believe it." And dismounting from the mule, he spoke, "Keep the animal. I make you a present of it." And the rascal took the beast, thanked him kindly, and rode on to join his comrades, while Simon continued his journey on foot. As soon as the old man got home, he told his housekeeper that he had bought a beast under the belief that it was a mule, but that it turned out to be a donkey. At least, so he had been assured by several people he met on the road, and that in disgust he had given it at last away. "Oh, you simpleton!" cried Nina. "Didn't you see that you were only playing a trick on you? Really, I thought you'd have more gumption than that. That shouldn't have taken me from in that way." "Never mind," replied Simon. "I'll pay them 1's worth or 2 of that, or depend upon it that it won't be contexted with having got the donkey out of me, but they'll try by some new dodge to get something more, or I'm much mistaken." Now, there lived in the village, not far from Simon's house, a peasant who had 2 goats, so alike in every respect that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. Simon bought them both, paid a small price as he could for them, and leading them home with him, he told Nina to prepare a good meal, as he was going to invite some friends home to dinner. He ordered her to roast some veal and to boil a pair of chickens, and gave her some herbs to make it good and savory, and told her to bake the best tart that she could make. Then he took out one of the goats and tied it to a post in the courtyard, and gave it some grass to eat. But he bound the cord round its neck to the other goat, and led it to market. Hardly had he arrived there when the 3 gentlemen who had got his mule perceived him, and coming up to him, they said, Welcome, Mr. Simon. What brings you here? Are you on the lookout for a bargain? I've come to get some provisions, he answered, because some friends of mine are coming to dine with me today, and it would give me much pleasure if you were to honor me with your company as well. The accomplices willingly accepted the invitation, and after Simon had made all his purchases, he tied them to the goat's back, and said to it, in the presence of the three cheats, Now go home and tell Nina to roast the veal and boil the chickens, and tell her to prepare some savory with the herbs, and to bake the best tart she can make. Have you followed me? Then go, and heaven's blessing go with you. As soon as it felt itself free, the laden goat trotted off as quickly as it could, and to this day no one really knows what became of it. But Simon, after wandering about the market for some time with the three friends and some others he had picked up, returned home to his house. When he and his guests entered the courtyard, they noticed the goat tied to the posts, quietly chewing the cud. They were not at all a little astonished about this, and for some course they thought that the same goat that Simon had sent home laden with provisions. As soon as they reached the house, Mr. Simon said to the housekeeper, Well, Nina, have you done what I told the goat to tell you to do? The artful woman, who at once understood her master, answered, Certainly I have. The veal is roasted and the chickens boiled. That's all right, said Simon. When the three rogues saw the cooked meats and the tart in the oven, and heard Nina's words, they were nearly beside themselves with amazement, and began to consult at once how they were to get the goat for their own. At last, towards the end of the meal, having sought in vain for some cunning dodge to get the goat away from Mr. Simon, one of them said to him, Most worthy host, you must sell your goat to us. Simon replied that he was most unwilling to part with the creature, as no amount of money would make up for him for its loss. Still, if they were quite set on it, he would let them have the goat for 50 gold pieces. The knaves, who thought they were doing a capital piece of business, paid down the 50 gold pieces at once, and left the house quite happily, leading the goat with them. And when they got home, they said to their wives, You needn't begin to cook dinner for tomorrow. We'll send the provisions home. The following day they went to the market and bought chickens and other edibles, and after they had packed them all on the goat for the day, which they had brought with them, they told it all the dishes they wished their wives to prepare, and as soon as the goat felt itself free, it ran as quickly as it could, and was very soon lost to sight, and, as far as I know, it was never seen again. When the dinner hour approached, all three went home and asked their wives if the goat had returned with the necessary provisions, and had told them what they wished prepared for their meals. You old fools and blockheads! Cried their wives. How could you ever believe for a moment that a goat would do the work of a servant maid? You have been finely deceived for once in one way. Of course, if you are always talking from other people, your turn to be taken comes too. And this time you've been made to look pretty foolish. When the three comrades saw that Mr. Simon had got the better of them and had done them out of 50 gold pieces, they flew into such a rage that they made up their minds to kill him. And seizing their weapons for the purpose, they went to his house. But the sly old man, who was terrified for his life that the three rogues might do him some harm, was on his guard, and said to his housekeeper, Nina, take this bladder which is filled with blood, and hide it under your cloak. When these thieves come, I'll lay all the blame on you, and will pretend to be so angry that I will run at you with my knife, and pierce this bladder with it. Then you must fall on the ground as if you were dead, and leave the rest to me. Hardly had Simon said these words when the three rogues appeared and fell on him to kill him. "My friends," called out Simon to them, "what do you accuse me of? I am in no way to blame. Perhaps my housekeeper has done you some injury in which I know nothing." And with these words, he turned to Nina with his knife and struck it right into her, so that it pierced the bladder filled with blood. Instantly, the housekeeper fell down as if she were dead, and the blood streamed all over the ground. Simon then pretended to be seized with remorse at the sight of the dreadful catastrophe and cried out in a loud voice, "Unhappy wretch that I am! What have I done? Like a madman, I have killed the woman who is my prop and stay in my old age. How can I go on ever living without her?" And then he seized a pipe, and when he had blown into it for some time, Nina sprang up, alive and well. The rogues were more amazed than ever. They forgot their anger, and buying the pipe for 200 gold pieces, they went joyfully home. Not long after this, one of them quarreled with his wife, and in his rage he thrust his knife into her breast, so that she fell down dead to the ground. Then he took Simon's pipe and blew into it with all his might, in the hopes of calling his wife back to life. But he blew in vain, for the poor soul was as dead as a doornail. When one of his comrades heard what happened, he said, "You blockhead! You can't have done it properly. Just let me have a try." With these words, he seized his wife by her roots of the hair and cut her throat with a razor. And then he took the pipe and blew into it with all his might, but he couldn't bring her back to life. The same thing happened to the third rogue, so that there were all now 3, without wives. Full of wrath, they ran to Simon's house, and refusing to listen to a word of explanation or excuse, they seized the old man and put him into a sack, meaning to drown him in the neighboring river. On their way there, however, a sudden noise threw them in such a panic that they dropped the sack with Simon in it and ran for their lives. Soon after this, a shepherd happened to pass by with his flock, and while he was slowly following the sheep, he paused here and there by the wayside to browse on the tender grass, when he heard the pitiful voice wailing, "They insist on my taking her, and I don't want her, for I am too old, and I really can't have her." The shepherd was much startled, for he couldn't make out where these words, which were repeated more than once, came from, and looked about him to the right and to the left, and at last he perceived a sack in which Simon was hidden, and going up to it he opened it and discovered Simon repeating his dismal complaint. The shepherd asked him why he had been left there tied up in the sack. Simon replied that the king of the country had insisted on giving him one of his daughters as a wife, and that he refused the honor because he was too old and too frail, and the blue pill wasn't invented. The simple-minded shepherd, who believed the story, implicitly asked him, "Do you think the king of the country would give his daughter to me?" "Certainly, I know he would," answered Simon, "if you were tied up in this sack instead of me." Then, getting out of the sack, he tied up the confiding shepherd in it instead, and at his request fastened it securely and drove the sheep on himself. An hour had scarcely passed when the 3 rogues returned to the place where they had left Simon in the sack, and, without opening it, one of them seized it and threw it into the river, and the poor shepherd was drowned instead of Mr. Simon. The 3 rogues, having wreaked their vengeance, set out for home. On the way there, they noticed a flock of sheep grazing not far from the road. They longed to steal a few of the lambs and approached the flock, and were more startled than ever to recognize Mr. Simon, whom they had just drowned in the river, at the shepherd who was looking after the sheep. They asked him how he had managed to get out of the river, which he replied, "Get along with you. You are no better than silly donkeys without my sense. If you had only drowned me in deeper water, I'd have returned with 3 times as many sheep." When the three rogues heard this, they said to him, "Oh, dear Mr. Simon, do us a favor and tie us up in sacks and throw us into the rivers that we may give up our thieving ways and become our owners of our own flocks." "I am ready," answered Simon, "to do what you please. There is nothing in the world I wouldn't do for you." So he took the 3 strong sacks and put a man in each of them, and fastened them up so tightly that they couldn't get out. And then he threw them all in the river. And that was the end of the 3 rogues. But Mr. Simon returned home to his faithful Nina, rich in flocks and gold, and lived for many a year after in health and happiness. It's a sheep on the bottom of a river. That seems to be another theme. Oh, look, an ad. The barbarical. Barbarical. What's a barbarical? Be right back. I got to do stuff. Ads over here. Nope, ads are still going. Okay. Was there any trivia this time? I didn't see any trivia pop up. Guess we didn't have any trivia. Doobie-doo. Just got the recap, didn't get the trivia. Okay, well. Let's get on to our third story then. Kojata. How long is this story? Hey, fairy tales. Hey, Matsu. Let's see. This one is 15 pages. Okay. Ouch. Let's say you have a cold. Sophia has a cold. Sounded like Waste is coming down with a cold. I just have a runny freaking nose. Of course, I'm not exactly in a snow threat right now either, so. I hope you're getting lots of hot tea and maybe soup, so. See, which one have I done already? I did. Already read the Enchanted Snake and the Biter bit. Which is strange, because I don't think there's anything in that story that had to do with the Biter bit. No. And none of my sound alerts are working, so I had to turn them all off. Oh, this is a Russian story. Okay. King Kojata. I'm going to have to look this one up. And one of Tolstoy's families did a book of fairy tales. I'm going to have to look to see if this one's in that book. Okay. Dang, hydrate. I think it's Alexei. Yeah. It's on my bookshelf somewhere. So the third story for this wonderful Friday Night of Fairy Tales. Clearly from Russia, apparently, which means the translation may be a little rough. King Kojata. There was once upon a time called a king called Kojata, whose beard was so long that it reached below his knees. 3 years had passed since his marriage, and he lived very happily with his wife. But heaven granted him no heir, which grieved the king greatly. One day he set forth from the capital in order to make a journey through his kingdom. He traveled for nearly a year through the different parts of his territory, and then, having seen all there was to see, he set forth on his homeward way. His travel for nearly a year... Oh, running on. As the day was very hot and sultry, he commanded his servants to pitch tents in an open field, and there await the cool of the evening. Suddenly a frightful thirst seized the king, and as he saw no water near, he mounted his horse and rode through the neighborhood, looking for a spring. Before long he came to a well filled to the brim with water, clear as crystal, and at the bosom of which a golden jug was floating. King Kojata at once tried to seize the vessel, but though he endeavored to grasp it with his right hand, and then with his left, the wretched thing always eluded his efforts and refused to let itself be caught. First with one hand, and then with two, the king did try to seize it, but like a fish, the goblet always slipped through his fingers and bobbed to the ground only to reappear at some other place and mock the king. "A plague on you," said King Kojata. "I can quench my thirst without you. and bending over the well, he lapped at the water so greedily that he plunged his face, beard and all, right into the crystal mirror. But when he had satisfied his thirst and wished to raise himself up, he couldn't lift his head because someone had held his beard fast in the water. "Who's there? Let me go!" cried King Kojata, but there was no answer. Only an awful face looked up from the bottom of the well with two great green eyes, glowing like emeralds, with a wide mouth reaching from ear to ear, showing 2 rows of glistening white teeth. And the king's beard was held, not by mortal hands, but by 2 claws. At last a hoarse voice sounded from the depths. "Your trouble is in vain, King Kojata. I will only let go on condition that you will give me something you know nothing about, and which you will find in your return home." The king didn't pause to ponder long. For what, thought he, could be in my palace without my knowing about it? The thing is absurd. So he answered quickly, "Yes, I promise you that you shall have it." And the voice replied, "Very well, but it will go ill with you if you fail to keep your promise." The claws then relaxed their hold, and the face disappeared in the depths. The king drew his chin out of the water and shook himself like a dog. Then he mounted his horse and rode thoughtfully home with his retinue. When they approached the capital, all the people came out to meet him with great joy and acclamation, and when the king reached his palace, the queen met him on the threshold. Beside her stood the prime minister, holding a little cradle in his hands, in which lay a newborn child as beautiful as the day. Then the whole thing dawned on the king, and groaning deeply, he muttered to himself, "So, this is what I did not know about." And the tears rolled down his cheeks. All the courtiers standing around were much amazed at the king's grief, but no one dared to ask him the cause of it. He took the child in his arms and kissed it tenderly. Then, laying it in his cradle, he determined to control his emotion and began to reign again as before. The secret of the king remained a secret, though the grave, careworn expression escaped no one's notice. And the instant dread that his child would be taken from him, poor Kojata knew no rest night or day. However, time went on, and nothing happened. Days and months and years passed, and the prince grew up into a beautiful youth, and at last the king himself forgot about the incident that had happened so long ago. One day the prince went out hunting, and going in pursuit of a wild boar, he soon lost track of the other huntsmen, and found himself quite alone in the middle of the dark wood. The trees grew so thick near together that it was almost impossible to see through them. Only straight in front of him lay a little patch of meadowland, overgrown with thistles and rank weeds, in the center of which a leafy lime tree reared itself. Suddenly a rustling sound was heard in the hollow of the tree, and an extraordinarily old man with green eyes and chin crept out of it. "A fine day, Prince Milan," said he. "You've kept me waiting a good number of years. It was high time for you to come and pay me a visit." "Who are you, in the name of wonder?" demanded the astonished prince. "You'll find out soon enough, but in the meantime, do as I bid you. Greet your father, King Kojata, from me, and don't forget to remind him of his debt. The time has long passed since it was due, and now he will have to pay it. Farewell for the present. We shall meet again." With these words, the old man disappeared into the tree, and the prince returned home, rather startled, and told his father all that he had seen and heard. The king grew as white as a sheet when he heard the prince's story, and said, "Woe is me, my son! The time has come when we must part." And with a heavy heart he told the prince what had happened at the time of his birth. "Don't worry or distress yourself, dear father," answered Prince Milan. "Things are never as bad as they look. Only give me a horse for my journey, and I'll wager you'll soon see me back again." The king gave him a beautiful charger with golden stirrups and a sword. The queen hung a little cross around his neck, and after much weeping and lamentation, the prince bade them all farewell and set forth on his journey. He rode straight on for 2 days, and on the 3rd day he came to a lake as smooth as glass and as clear as crystal. Not beneath the wind moved, not a leaf stirred. All was silent as a grave. Only on the still bosom of the lake 30 ducks with brilliant plumage swam about in the water. Not far from the shore, Prince Milan noticed 30 little white garments laying in the grass, and dismounting from his horse, he crept down under the high bulrushes, took one of the garments and hid himself with it behind the bushes which grew around the lake. The ducks swam all over the place, dived down into the depths and rose again, and glided through the waves. At last, tired of sporting themselves, they swam to the shore, and 29 of them put on their little white garments, and instantly turned into so many beautiful maidens. When they finished dressing, and they disappeared. Only the 30th little duck didn't come onto land. It swam close to shore, and giving out a piercing cry, it stretched its neck up timidly and gazed wildly around, and then dived under again. Prince Milan's heart was so moved with pity for the poor little creature that he came out from behind the bulrushes to see if he could be of any help. As soon as the duck perceived him, it cried in a human voice, "Oh, dear Prince Milan, for the love of heaven, give me back my garment, and I will be ever so grateful to you." The prince laid the little garment on the bank beside her, and stepped back into the bulrushes. In a few seconds, a beautiful girl in a white robe stood before him, so fair and young and sweet that no pen could ever describe her. She gave the prince her hand and spoke. "My thanks, Prince Milan, for your courtesy. I am the daughter of a wicked magician, and my name is Hysantia. My father has 30 young daughters and is a mighty ruler of the underworld, with many castles and great riches. He has been expecting you for ages, but you have no fear if you will only follow my advice. As soon as you come into the presence of my father, throw yourself at once onto the ground and approach him on your knees. Don't mind that he stamps furiously with his feet and curses and swears. I'll attend to the rest. In the meantime, we had better be off." With these words, the beautiful Hysantia stamped on the ground with her little foot, and the earth opened, and they both sank down into the lower world. The palace of the magician was all hewn in a single carbuncle, lighting up the whole surrounding region, and Prince Milan walked into it gaily. The magician sat on a throne, a sparkling crown on his head. His eyes blazed like green fire, and instead of hands, he had claws. As soon as Prince Milan entered, he flung himself to his knees. The magician stamped loudly with his feet, glared frightfully out of his green eyes, and cursed so loudly that the whole underwood shook. But the prince, mindful of the counsel he had been given, wasn't the least afraid, and approached the throne still on his knees. At last the magician laughed aloud and said, "You rogue! You have been well advised to make me laugh. I won't be your enemy any more. Welcome to the underworld." All the same, for your delay in coming here, we must demand 3 services of you. For today you may go, but tomorrow I shall have something more to say to you. When then 2 servants led Prince Milan to a beautiful apartment, and he lay down fearlessly on the soft bed which had been prepared for him, and soon fell fast asleep. Early the next morning the magician sent for him, and said, "Let's see now what you've learnt. In the first place you must build me a palace tonight, the roof of purest gold, the walls of marble, and the windows of crystal. All around you must lay out a beautiful garden with fish ponds and little artistic waterfalls. If you can do all of this, I will reward you richly. But if you don't, well, I shall have your head." "Oh, you wicked monster," said Prince Milan. "You might as well have put me to death at once." Sadly, he returned to his room, and with bent head and sad brooding over his cruel fate till evening. When it grew dark, the little bee flew by and knocked at the window and said, "Open, let me in." Milan opened the window quickly, and as soon as the bee had entered, it changed into the beautiful Hyacinthia. "Good morning, Prince Milan. Why are you so sad?" "How can I keep from being sad? Your father threatens me with death, and I see myself already without a head." "And what have you made up your mind to do?" "There's nothing to be done, and after all I suppose only one can die only once." "Don't be foolish, my dear prince, but keep up your spirits, for there is no need to despair. Go to bed, and when you wake up tomorrow morning, the palace will be finished. Then you must go all around it, giving a tap here and there on the walls, to look as if you had just finished it." And so it all turned out just as she had said. As soon as it was daylight, Prince Milan stepped out of his room and found a palace which was quite a work of art, down to the very smallest detail. The magician himself was not a little astonished at its beauty, and could hardly believe his eyes. "Oh, you certainly are a splendid workman," he said to the prince. "I see you are very clever with your hands. Now I must see if you are equally accomplished with your head. I have 30 daughters in my house, all beautiful princesses. Tomorrow I will place the whole 30 in a row. You must walk past them 3 times, and the 3rd time you must show me which is my youngest daughter, Hyacinthia. If you don't guess rightly, you shall lose your head." "This time you've made a mistake," said Prince Milan, and going to his room he sat down at the window. "Just fancy my not recognizing the beautiful Hyacinthia. Why, that's the easiest thing in the world." "Not as easy as you think," cried the little bee who was flying past. "If I weren't to help you, you'd never guess. We're 30 sisters exactly alike that our own father can hardly distinguish us apart." "Then what am I to do?" asked Prince Milan. "Listen," answered Hyacinthia. "You'll recognize me by a tiny fly I shall have on my left cheek. But be careful, for you might easily make a mistake." The next day the magician again commanded Prince Milan to be led before him. His daughters were all arranged in a straight row in front of him, dressed exactly alike, and with their eyes bent to the ground. "Well, now, you genius," said the magician, "look at these beauties 3 times, and then tell us which is Princess Hyacinthia." Prince Milan went past them and looked at them closely, but they were all precisely alike, that they looked like one face reflected the other in 30 mirrors. And the fly was nowhere to be seen. The second time he passed them all, he saw nothing. But the 3rd time he perceived a fly stealing down one cheek, causing it to blush a faint pink. Then the prince seized the girl's hand and cried out, "This is Princess Hyacinthia." "You're right again," said the magician in amazement. but I've still another task for you to do. Before this candle I shall light burns to the socket. You must have made a pair of boots reaching to my knees. If they aren't finished in that time, off comes your head." The prince returned to his room in despair. Then the Princess Hyacinthia came to him once more, changed into the likeness of a bee, and asked him, "Why so sad, Prince Milan?" "How can I help being sad? Your father has set me this time an impossible task. Before a candle, which is he burns to a socket, I am to make a pair of boots. What does a prince know about shoemaking? I can't do it. I'll lose my head. What kind of cobbler do you think I am?" "And what do you mean to do?" asked Princess Hyacinthia. "Well, what is there to be done? What he demands I can't and won't do, so he'll just have to make an end of me." "Now, my dearest, I love you dearly, and you shall marry me, and I'll either save your life or die with you. We must fly now as quickly as we can, for there is no other way of escape." With these words she breathed on the window, and her breath froze the pain. And then she led Milan out of the room with her, shut the door, and threw away the key. Hand in hand they hurried to the spot where they had descended to the lower tower, and at last reached the banks of the lake. Prince Milan's charger was still grazing on the grass which grew near the water. The horse no sooner recognizing his master than neighed loudly with joy, and springing towards him, it stood as if rooted to the ground, while Prince Milan and Hyacinthia jumped on its back. Then it sped outwards like an arrow from a bow. In the meantime, the magician was waiting impatiently for the prince. Enraged by his delay, he sent servants to fetch him, for the appointed time was past. The servants came to the door, and finding it locked, they knocked. But the frozen breath on the window replied in Prince Milan's voice, "I am coming directly." With the answer they returned to the magician. But when the prince did not appear, after a time he sent the servants a second time to bring him. The frozen breath always gave the same answer, but the prince never came. At last the magician lost all patience and demanded the door to be burst open. And when his servants did so, they found the room empty, and the frozen breath laughed aloud. Out of his mind with rage, the magician ordered the prince to be pursued. Then the wild chase began. "I hear horses' hoofs behind us," said Hyacinthia to Prince Milan. He sprang from the saddle and put his ear to the ground and listened. "Yes," he answered. "They are pursuing us, and are quite close." "Then no time must be lost," said Hyacinthia, and she immediately turned herself into a river, and Prince Milan into an iron bridge, and the charger into a blackbird. Behind the bridge the road branched off in 3 ways. The magician's servants hurried after the fresh tracks, but when they came to the bridge, they stood, not knowing which road to take, as the footprints had suddenly stopped. And there were 3 paths after them from which to choose. In fear and trembling they returned to tell the magician what had happened. He flew into a dreadful rage when he saw them and screamed out, "Oh, you fools! The river and the bridge were they! Go back and bring them to me at once, or I will be the worse for you!" Then the pursuit begins afresh. "I hear horses' hooves," said Hyacinthia. The prince dismounted and put his ear to the ground. "They are hurrying after us, and they are quite near." In a moment, the Princess Hyacinthia had changed herself, the prince, and his charger into a thick wood where 1,000 paths and roads crossed each other. Their pursuers entered the forest, but searched in vain for Prince Milan and his bride. At last, they found themselves back at the same spot that they had started from, and in despair they returned once more with empty hands to the magician. "Then I'll go after them, the wretches, myself!" he shouted. "Bring a horse at once! They shan't escape me!" Once more the beautiful Hyacinthia murmured, "I hear horses' hooves quite near." And the prince answered, "They're pursuing us hotly and are very close." "We're lost now. Father himself, but at the first time his power ceases, he may chase us. Hand me your cross." Prince Milan loosened from his neck the little gold cross his mother had given him, and as soon as Hyacinthia grasped it, she had changed herself into a church, Milan into a monk, and the horse into a belfry. They had hardly come to this when the magician and his servants rode up. "Do you see no one pass on horseback, Reverend Father?" he asked the monk. "Prince Milan and Princess Hyacinthia have just gone on this minute. They stopped for a few minutes in the church to say their prayers and bade me light this wax candle for you, and to give you their love." "I'd like to wring their necks," said the magician, and made all haste home, where he had every one of his servants beaten within an inch of their lives. Prince Milan rode on slowly with his bride without fearing any further pursuit. The sun was just setting, and its last rays lit up the large city where they were approaching. Prince Milan was suddenly seized with an ardent desire to enter the town. "Oh, my beloved," implored Hyacinthia, "please don't go, for I'm frightened and fear some evil." "What are you afraid of?" asked the prince. "We'll only go and look and see if it's a town for about an hour, and then we'll continue our journey to my father's kingdom." "The town is very easy to get into, but more difficult to get out of," sighed Hyacinthia. "But let it be as you wish. Go, and I will await you here. But I will first change myself into a white milestone. Only I pray that you be very careful. The king and queen of this town will come out to meet you, leading a little child with them. Whatever you do, don't kiss the child, or you will forget me and all that has happened to us. I will wait you here for 3 days." The prince hurried to the town, but Hyacinthia remained behind, disguised as a white milestone on the road. The first day passed, and then the second, and at last the third also, but Prince Milan did not return, for he had not taken Hyacinthia's device. The king and queen came out to meet him, and as she had said, leading with them a lovely fair-haired little girl, whose eyes shone like 2 clear stars. The child at once caressed the prince, who, carried away by its beauty, bent down and kissed it on the cheek. From that moment his memory became blank, and he forgot all about the beautiful Hyacinthia. When the prince did not return, poor Hyacinthia wept bitterly, and changing herself from a milestone into a little blue field flower. "I will grow here on the wayside until some passerby tramples me underfoot." And one of her tears remained as a dewdrop and sparkled on the little blue flower. Now, it happened shortly after this that an old man passed by, and seeing the flower, he was delighted at its beauty. He pulled up carefully by the roots and carried it home, where he planted it in a pot and watered it and tended the little plant carefully. And now the most extraordinary thing happened, for from this moment everything in the old man's house was changed. When he awoke in the morning, he always found his room tidied and put in such beautiful order that not a speck of dust was to be found anywhere. And when he came home at midday, he found the table laid out with the most dainty food, and he had only to sit down and enjoy himself to his heart's content. At first he was a little surprised, and he didn't know what to think. But after a time he grew quite a little uncomfortable, and went to an old witch to ask for advice. The witch said, "Get up before the cock crows, and watch carefully till you see something move, and then throw this cloth quickly over it, and you'll see what will happen." All night the old man never closed an eye. When the first ray of light entered the room, he noticed that the little blue flower began to tremble, and at last it rose out of the pot and flew around the room, putting everything in order, swept away the dust, and lit the fire. And in great haste the old man sprang from his bed and covered the flower with the cloth the old witch had given him. And in a moment the beautiful Princess Hyacinthia stood before him. "What have you done?" she cried. "Why have you called me back to life? For I have no desire to live, since my bridegroom, the beautiful Prince Milan, has deserted me." "Prince Milan is going to get married," replied the old man. Everything is got ready for the feast, and all the invited guests are flocking to the palace from all sides. The beautiful Hyacinthia cried bitterly when she heard this. Then she dried her tears and went into the town dressed as a peasant woman. She went straight to the king's kitchen, where the white-aproned cooks were running about in great confusion. The princess went up to the head cook and said, "Dear cook, please listen to my request. Let me make a wedding cake for Prince Milan." The busy cook was just going to refuse her demand outright and order her out of the kitchen, but the words died on his lips when he turned and beheld the beautiful Hyacinthia, and he answered politely, "You have just come in the nick of time, fair maiden. Bake your cake, and I will myself lay it before Prince Milan." The cake was soon made. The invited guests were already thronging around the table when the head cook entered the room, bearing a beautiful wedding cake on a silver dish, and laid it before Prince Milan. The guests were all lost in admiration, for the cake was quite a work of art. Prince Milan at once proceeded to cut it open, when, to his surprise, 2 white doves sprang out of it, and one of them said to the other, "My dear mate, do not fly away and leave me, and forget me as Prince Milan forgot his beloved Hyacinthia." Milan sighed deeply when he heard what the little dove said, and then he jumped up suddenly from the table and ran to the door, where he found the beautiful Hyacinthia waiting for him. Outside stood his faithful charger, pawing the ground. Without pausing for a moment, Milan and Hyacinthia mounted him and galloped as fast as they could into the country of King Kojata. The king and queen received them with such joy and gladness as had never been seen or heard before, and they all lived happily for the rest of their lives. And that story was from Russia. So you can tell that a lot of different elements are used in different countries, and they managed to go everywhere. And I can't tell if I'm still streaming or not. Because OBS is frozen, but it says I'm still going. But the video feeds are absolutely still, and that is creepy. So I honestly don't know if it's going. It says it's recording. It says we're still live. I'm not hearing anything at all in the stream. So it's a little on the disturbing side. Okay, I'm still hearing the stream, but I'm not seeing the video move, though. I don't know if that's just my computer or what. The audio is still going, though. But my OBS video feed looks like it's completely frozen. It's not letting me open YouTube Studio. I don't know if there's anyone in chat to tell me if it's still going or not. That's just lovely. Am I completely frozen? Well, Let's be damned. Let's change scenes and see if it does anything. Okay, I changed scenes to my Be Right Back screen. I hear the music from my Be Right Back screen. Oh, I think I may go ahead and end it for the night since techno monsters have reared their heads. And hopes and prayers my computer stops being a pain in the ass. Thank you everyone for coming in tonight. Whoever all may or may not be here. It's only showing one. So I guess I'll just go ahead and kill it for the night. I hope everyone who watches this now or in the past has a good evening. And I will hopefully see you next Thursday for some Sherlock Holmes. Have a good night.